The cameras had barely settled when Ted Cruz leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the kind of smirk that always seemed rehearsed. His laughter, sharp, dismissive, and designed to wound, cut through the chamber like a knife. He wasn't laughing with the room, he was laughing at her, at Jasmine Crockett, at her law degree, at the very idea that she, a black woman from Texas, could stand across from him with equal authority and command. For a split second, that laughter seemed to tilt the air. Some in the chamber shifted uncomfortably, others chuckled along, eager to stay in step with Cruz's performance. But underneath it all, there was a chill, a familiar, ugly echo of the same elitism that had kept so many voices silenced for so long. Cruz leaned in, voice dripping with condescension, as if her credentials were a punchline, as if her entire journey was nothing more than a setup for his sneer. It wasn't policy he was debating, it was dignity he was mocking, and in that moment it looked like another episode of the same old Washington theater, the powerful trying to shrink the voices that dared to rise against them. But then came the pause. Crockett didn't flinch, she didn't bow her head. She looked at him, steady, unshaken, unblinking. The laughter still hung in the air, but already the balance of power was shifting. Because what Ted Cruz didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett had heard this laugh before. From men who underestimated her, from opponents who thought her background, her accent, her very presence made her less than. And every time she had turned that derision into fire. The chamber waited. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. What would she say? How could anyone respond to such open contempt? Cruz thought the moment was his. He thought his laughter would write the headline. But what Jasmine Crockett said next is the moment America can't stop replaying. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a strike at the very heart of arrogance, a reminder that truth, delivered with dignity, cuts deeper than mockery ever could. And as her first words broke the silence, the entire room and the country beyond it realized they were about to witness something unforgettable. You said,
To understand why Cruz mocked Jasmine Crockett's law degree, you have to understand the performance he was staging. For years, Cruz has thrived on a theater of arrogance, rolling his Ivy League pedigree into a weapon, wielding it not as proof of scholarship, but as a bludgeon of superiority. In his mind, degrees were not credentials, but trophies. And like any trophy holder too long insulated by applause, he believed he had the right to laugh at those he thought beneath him. So when Jasmine Crockett invoked her law degree in the course of the debate, Cruz didn't hear evidence of experience or authority. He heard an opportunity to diminish. He saw a woman, young, black, Southern, unapologetically outspoken, and he decided the rules of the game allowed him to sneer. That laugh wasn't an accident. It was a dismissal of her right to even be in the conversation. But that dismissal carried higher stakes than Cruz could ever comprehend. Because Crockett wasn't just defending her own education or her own name. She was defending every young woman who had ever been told she was too ambitious. Every immigrant child whose accent was mocked when they tried to speak in class. Every student of color who worked twice as hard just to be seen as half as worthy. This was bigger than a spat between two politicians. This was a referendum on who gets to be taken seriously in America and who gets laughed at when they try. For women watching across the country, Crockett's silence in that first moment wasn't weakness. It was recognition. They had been there before, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in family dinners where the weight of their words was measured against the smirk of someone who thought their voice didn't matter. And for every marginalized voice that ever carried the burden of proving their worth, Cruz's laugh was a trigger. It was the sound of centuries of belittlement dressed up as humor. And yet, this is where the power of the stakes becomes clear, because Crockett wasn't just another politician scrambling for airtime. She was a woman who carried her community, her constituents, her very identity into that chamber. When Cruz laughed, he wasn't just mocking a degree. He was mocking the story of everyone who had to fight their way into institutions that weren't built for them. For progressives, for immigrants, for anyone who has been told their education, their career, their dreams were less than, this was more than a moment. It was a test. Would dignity answer back? Would arrogance be allowed to stand unchallenged once again? Or would someone finally remind the room that truth doesn't come with a pedigree, it comes with courage? Cruz thought he was scoring points with his sneer. He thought the smirk was his weapon, the laugh his shield. But in his arrogance, he missed the truth staring him down from across the table. Jasmine Crockett was not just another opponent. She was the culmination of 1,000 unheard voices rising in one steady response. And that meant the stakes were no longer about Cruz's laugh. They were about whether America would once again let mockery define its politics, or whether dignity, sharpened by lived struggle, would claim the moment.
To grasp the weight of that moment, we need to step back and look at the man behind the laugh. Ted Cruz didn't just stumble into arrogance. It became his brand, his shield, and his weapon long before he smirked across the chamber at Jasmine Crockett. Born into privilege, armed with an elite education, Cruz carried Harvard Law on his resume like a crown. He liked to remind audiences of his achievements: clerk for a Supreme Court justice, champion debater, constitutional lawyer. In his own mythology, Cruz was always the smartest man in the room. And yet, instead of using that education to elevate others, he wielded it to diminish them. To Cruz, credentials weren't proof of responsibility, they were ammunition. Over the years, he honed this into an art. Watch the tapes: the raised eyebrow, the smug pause before delivering a quip, the calculated laugh when an opponent dared to confront him. Whether it was a Senate colleague, a journalist, or a witness in a hearing, Cruz thrived on belittlement. He didn't argue points to build consensus. He mocked to dominate. It was easier, after all, to sneer at someone's existence than to debate the heart of their argument. But beneath that theater of superiority lies contradiction. Cruz himself, the Harvard man, the constitutional scholar, has built a career on bending rules when it suits him and mocking the very principles he claims to defend. He touts his Ivy League prestige, yet derides others for their education. He rails against elitism, yet embodies it every time he dismisses a degree that wasn't earned from the institutions he sanctifies. And the hypocrisy doesn't end there. He casts himself as a defender of the people, yet his laughter has most often been directed at those who embody the people he claims to represent. Teachers testifying about school funding, activists raising concerns about justice, women demanding accountability. Instead of engagement, they got a smirk. Instead of answers, they got laughter. Cruz has always understood that in politics, a sneer can sting louder than a fact. He's weaponized it to paint opponents as small, as unworthy, as unserious. And for too long, that strategy worked. Too many headlines treated his jabs as sharp wit instead of open contempt. Too many debates ended with Cruz framed as the tough talker rather than the bully he had become. But cracks have always shown. His colleagues in the Senate, even those in his own party, often bristle at his condescension. Whispers describe him as isolated, disliked, too enamored with his own cleverness. He sought validation not in unity, but in division. The more he laughed at others, the lonelier he became. And yet he pressed forward, doubling down on the persona. Every insult delivered on camera, every mocking soundbite reinforced his image to a base that mistook cruelty for strength. Cruz thrived on this mistaken admiration, feeding it with more sarcasm, more dismissals, more smirks. So when Jasmine Crockett mentioned her law degree, he reached for the old playbook. He thought the formula would hold: laugh, diminish, move on.
He thought his Harvard crown would shine brighter than her words, his laugh loud enough to drown her credentials. After all, it always had before. But here lies the villain's fatal flaw: hubris. Cruz had mistaken repetition for invincibility. He believed his old tactics would forever go unchallenged, that mocking was safer than debating, that arrogance was stronger than dignity. What he didn't account for was the rise of a new kind of voice in American politics, voices like Jasmine Crockett's, voices unafraid of his sneer, unshaken by his smirk, unwilling to let laughter define their worth. Because while Cruz was building a career on tearing others down, Crockett was building hers on lifting others up. While he sharpened insults, she sharpened integrity. While he rehearsed condescension, she embodied resilience. And those two forces, mockery and dignity, were about to collide in full view of the nation. Cruz had faced critics before, but most retreated under the weight of his sarcasm. Most swallowed the humiliation and let him claim the last word. But this time would be different. And yet, this time, his trademark arrogance met a wall he couldn't scale.
To truly understand why Jasmine Crockett did not flinch when Ted Cruz laughed at her law degree, we need to step into her story. A story carved out of grit, persistence, and a refusal to bend in the face of forces that told her she did not belong. Crockett's journey to that chamber was not lined with privilege. Unlike Cruz, who could flaunt his Ivy League trophies, her path to law school was littered with obstacles that would have stopped a weaker spirit. She wasn't born into a world that opened doors at the mention of her name. Instead, she had to push against doors that slammed shut over and over until they cracked open under the sheer weight of her determination. Her law degree wasn't a punchline. It was proof of survival. Proof that despite being underestimated, doubted, and dismissed, she had walked into classrooms where people like her were in the minority and emerged with the credentials that would one day empower her to speak truth to power. Where Cruz carried his Harvard badge as a weapon, Crockett carried her degree as a shield forged in fire. But her story was never just about herself. Even before she entered Congress, Jasmine Crockett had made her career about service, representing those whose voices rarely reached the chambers of power. She cut her teeth in courtrooms defending civil rights, standing beside clients who couldn't afford to buy influence, fighting for justice in a system that too often looks away from the marginalized. Every late night, every case taken against the odds was a declaration. She would not bow to the machinery of dismissal. That resilience became her identity. Not resilience born of comfort, but the kind that comes from being told no so many times that you decide to carve out your own yes. She was not handed her seat in Congress. She earned it. Every voter who saw in her the reflection of their own battles, every community member who watched her stand tall against entrenched power, helped lift her to that chamber. She walked into Washington not as an outsider begging for a place in, but as a voice carrying the weight of those who had never been invited in. And make no mistake, that weight was both burden and strength. Because when Ted Cruz laughed at her law degree, he wasn't just mocking her. He was mocking the single mother who works 2 jobs to send her child to college. He was mocking the immigrant who learns a new language just to sit in a classroom and chase a diploma. He was mocking the countless young women of color who walk into lecture halls only to be told, through silence or smirks, that they don't belong. Crockett knew this because she had lived it. She knew what it was to be underestimated. She knew what it was to have her intellect questioned before she ever opened her mouth. And she had turned those slights into fuel, each one sharpening her edge, each one preparing her for a moment like this. Her values, too, set her apart. Where Cruz wrapped himself in elitism, Crockett grounded herself in empathy. She never forgot the people she served. To her, a degree wasn't a badge of superiority, but a responsibility. It meant using knowledge to uplift, not to mock. It meant fighting not just for her name to be respected, but for every name too often erased from the record. In that chamber, when she stared down Cruz's laughter, she wasn't just defending her own dignity.
She was defending the principle that America belongs to more than its privileged few. She was proving that courage, sharpened by struggle, can match any smirk, no matter how powerful the man behind it thinks he is. The story of Jasmine Crockett is not the story of someone who stumbled into history by accident. It is the story of someone who was forged for it. Every courtroom battle, every fight for her community, every dismissal she turned into victory was a rehearsal for this very confrontation. And that's what Cruz failed to see. He saw a law degree he thought he could laugh off. What he didn't see was the years of resilience that degree represented. He didn't see the identity rooted in survival, the service grounded in sacrifice, the values tested and proven. He didn't see that while his own career had been cushioned by privilege, hers had been defined by perseverance. So when the moment came, she did not tremble. She did not shrink. She did not lash out in desperation. She stood steady. Not because the insult meant nothing, but because her life had prepared her for worse. Her silence before she spoke was not hesitation, it was strength, the kind of strength that draws its power from every battle won on the way to that chamber. And that is why America would not forget what happened next, because Jasmine Crockett's words were not just a response to one man's laugh, they were the culmination of a lifetime of resilience, spoken on behalf of everyone who had been laughed at and refused to break. Every trial of her past had sharpened her for the trial she was about to deliver.
The air in the chamber was taut, charged with a tension that buzzed like static before a storm. Cruz leaned forward, sensing his moment. His smirk widened into a grin that bordered on theatrical, as though he were auditioning for an audience of pundits rather than engaging in a debate about the future of the nation. "You see, Congresswoman," he drawled, voice oozing with mockery, "you can wave around that law degree all you want, but we both know it doesn't make you an authority. Certainly not on this issue. Some of us," he gestured grandly toward himself, "actually studied the Constitution at a higher level." The words landed like darts, sharp but predictable, rehearsed in their cruelty. A few chuckles rippled across his side of the aisle, an echo chamber of validation that Cruz had always counted on. He mistook those chuckles for strength. He mistook them for dominance. Crockett, meanwhile, sat still, her face unreadable. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, her shoulders square, her posture unshaken. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like she was waiting her turn. But those who had followed her career knew better. She wasn't waiting. She was listening, measuring, storing every word Cruz uttered like ammunition she would later fire back with precision. He pressed on, each jab a little louder, a little more reckless. "Honestly, Congresswoman, if your law degree were half as impressive as you make it out to be, you'd understand the basics here. But I suppose some schools hand those out a little more easily than others." There it was, the dagger he thought would end the exchange. Cruz leaned back, reveling in the ripple of approval from a few supporters who couldn't resist smirking along with him. He believed he had landed the knockout blow. But across the room, Crockett's stillness was not defeat. It was control. Her eyes narrowed only slightly, her lips pressing into the faintest of lines. It was the look of someone who had weathered insults far harsher than this, who understood that sometimes the greatest power comes not in speaking first, but in letting arrogance dig its own grave. The chamber shifted with each exchange. Cruz's voice grew louder, his jabs sharper, his tone more desperate to provoke. He mistook her calm for weakness, not realizing it was the strongest response she could possibly give.
With every insult, he was unraveling himself, showing the world the smallness beneath the smirk. Viewers at home leaned forward, sensing the imbalance. The villain was talking too much, the hero too little. And in that silence, suspense swelled. "Tell me, Congresswoman," he sneered, one last attempt to twist the knife, "do you really expect this committee, or the American people, to take your credentials seriously?" A hush fell, just faint enough to be felt. The mockery had peaked, the arrogance fully on display. Cruz thought he had painted her into a corner. He thought the laugh, the sneer, the jab, the performance had sealed his dominance in the exchange. But in reality, the audience wasn't laughing with him anymore. They were waiting for the inevitable clapback that hung like thunderclouds on the horizon. Crockett's gaze met his, steady and unblinking. Her silence stretched, commanding the air more forcefully than any insult could. It was the silence of someone gathering strength, the silence that makes an opponent realize, too late, that they've overplayed their hand.
The silence was thick, almost unbearable. Ted Cruz leaned back, convinced he had cornered her. His smugness filled the chamber as though he had already claimed victory. But Jasmine Crockett did not rush to fill the void. She allowed the silence to stretch, each second amplifying the tension until it became its own kind of weapon. Then, with a voice steady enough to cut glass, she began. "Senator Cruz," she said evenly, her words deliberate, "I didn't earn my law degree to impress you." A ripple moved through the room. The tone wasn't defensive, it was declarative. A truth dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. She leaned forward, her voice gathering strength, her cadence sharpening into something that felt less like debate and more like cross-examination. "I earned it to serve the people who will never set foot in Harvard. The people you mock every time you use your education as a weapon instead of a responsibility." The chamber stirred. Cruz's smirk faltered just slightly. He shifted in his seat, as if the ground beneath him had tilted. Crockett pressed on, each phrase measured, each pause strategic. "You laugh at my degree, but what you're really laughing at, Senator, is every young woman of color who fought her way through classrooms designed to make her invisible. You're laughing at every student who worked nights to pay tuition while your privilege cushioned you. You're laughing at the very people we swore an oath to represent." A murmur ran through the audience. The tone of the room was changing. Cruz's supporters weren't chuckling anymore. They were shifting uncomfortably, realizing the air was no longer his to command. She glanced at him, calm but unyielding. "And let me remind you, Senator, degrees don't argue cases. People do. I've stood in courtrooms fighting for those without a voice. I've gone toe-to-toe with prosecutors, judges, systems designed to break people, and I won, not because of a name on a diploma, but because of the truth I carried with me." Gasps, nods, whispers. Her words carried not like shouts, but like undeniable facts. Every pause allowed them to sink in deeper. Every sentence framed like evidence laid out in a courtroom. Cruz tried to interject, but the momentum had shifted beyond his grasp. She didn't raise her volume, she didn't need to. Dignity was her armor, precision her weapon. "You may wear your Harvard degree like a crown, but the crown doesn't make the king. The people do. And right now, the people are watching you laugh at their struggle, their sacrifices, their dreams." The chamber was no longer an arena for his performance. It had become her courtroom.
And she was cross-examining not just Cruz, but the entire culture of elitism he embodied. She paused again, letting the silence return for a beat. Every eye fixed on her, every camera zoomed in closer. Then came the punchline, sharp, devastating, and impossible to ignore. So Senator Cruz, she leaned forward just enough to erase any doubt of her intent. Mock me all you want, but remember this: the law doesn't remember your laugh. History doesn't record your smirk. It records the truth. And the truth is, you just exposed yourself, not me. The chamber erupted. Gasps gave way to murmurs, murmurs to audible applause, stifled only by the formality of the setting. Even those who had chuckled with Cruz moments earlier found themselves silent now, unwilling to be associated with the arrogance she had so cleanly dismantled. Cruz shifted again, his face tightening. His smirk was gone, replaced with the faint flush of a man unaccustomed to being outmaneuvered by dignity. He tried to mask it, but the cameras were merciless. Viewers at home could see it, the blink, the swallow, the microsecond of hesitation that betrayed his unraveling. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't bask in the moment. She simply leaned back, her composure intact, her words still echoing in the air. That was the brilliance of it. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to pile insult upon insult. Her strength was in restraint, in proving that truth delivered with calm conviction could thunder louder than mockery ever could. The crowd felt it. The country watching felt it. This wasn't just a clapback. It was a reversal of power in real time. A man who had built his image on belittling others had been stripped of his armor by a woman who refused to play his game. And for a moment, it seemed as if even Cruz himself understood. He fiddled with his papers, cleared his throat, tried to regain footing, but the footing was gone. Crockett had shifted the ground, and now he stood exposed. The scene ended not with her shouting him down, but with her silence after the strike, her refusal to add anything more. She had said enough, more than enough. And in that decision, she showed the difference between arrogance and dignity. Arrogance craves the last word. Dignity knows when the truth has already spoken. The cameras lingered on Cruz, then on Crockett, then on the faces around the room. Astonishment, admiration, even awe. Millions at home replayed the exchange in their minds, knowing they had just witnessed a political moment that would not fade quickly. And yet, what no one in that chamber realized then was that the story was only beginning. The viral clip was already racing toward the world outside, toward a digital audience hungry for justice, for inspiration, for proof that arrogance could still be silenced by courage. Crockett's words had landed like thunder, but the true impact wouldn't be felt until the world reacted.
The clip hit the internet before Cruz had even shuffled his papers. A 30-second exchange, distilled and electrified, was suddenly everywhere. Twitter, or what people now called X, lit up like a bonfire. Within minutes, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Crockett Clapback. Hashtag Dignity over Mockery. Hashtag Ted Lost. One user wrote, "I just witnessed the end of Cruz's smug era." Another clipped the moment of his smirk melting and set it to slow motion with the caption, "When the roast becomes reality." TikTok spun the exchange into its own theater. Creators reenacted the lines with dramatic lighting, courtroom soundtracks, and split-screen memes. One popular version showed Crockett's words delivered over the beat of a gospel choir, every sentence punctuated with applause. Another paired Cruz's fading smirk with a trending soundbite. "Girl, don't do it. It's not worth it. She did it." Millions watched, commented, stitched, and shared. By nightfall, late-night comedians had their monologues locked. Trevor Noah quipped, "Ted Cruz tried to laugh off Jasmine Crockett's degree, but she gave him a lesson you can't get at Harvard." Seth Meyers played the clip twice, once in real time and again in exaggerated slow motion, joking,
This is what it looks like when dignity eats arrogance for breakfast. Even conservative leading pundits couldn't ignore it. Some tried spinning it as overreaction, but the raw clip undercut every attempt. The reaction wasn't just humor, it was admiration. Activists, law students, working-class families flooded timelines with messages of solidarity. One post read, "She spoke for all of us who've had our intelligence mocked because of where we come from." A viral thread from a young Latina law student declared, "Watching Crockett dismantle Cruz gave me the courage to keep going. My degree will never be less because of my background." Thousands echoed the sentiment. Meanwhile, allies within Congress chimed in. Some shared the video with short celebratory captions, "This is leadership. Crockett 1, Cruz 0, the people's lawyer." Others used it as a rallying cry for broader fights against elitism, gender bias, and racial double standards. For once, the noise wasn't just outrage. It was unity, catharsis, joy. Opponents, however, scrambled. Cruz's defenders tried to frame the laughter as light-hearted banter, but the footage told a different story. His smirk, his tone, the way Crockett's words dismantled his performance, it was all undeniable. And the harder they pushed their narrative, the more hollow it rang against the resonance of Crockett's poise. The shockwaves reached beyond politics. In classrooms, professors played the clip as a case study in rhetoric. In community centers, it became a spark for conversations about representation. Memes turned the moment into a cultural shorthand for resilience under pressure. When someone dismisses you, answer with dignity, not anger. For many, this was more than entertainment. It was vindication. Generations who had been sneered at, who had felt the sting of being underestimated because of where they studied, how they spoke, or what they looked like, now had a champion on the national stage. Crockett had flipped the script, showing that the tools of arrogance could be dismantled with calm precision. And as the clip circled the globe, it became something more than viral content. It became a rallying symbol, a reminder that moments of courage can ripple outward, reshaping narratives far beyond the chamber where they began. But beyond the laughter and the headlines was a deeper lesson.
When the noise faded, when the memes slowed, what lingered was not the insult or even the laughter. It was the clarity of the answer. Jasmine Crockett had taken a sneer meant to belittle her and transformed it into a mirror that reflected something larger, a nation's hunger for dignity over arrogance. In that chamber, Cruz's laughter was the old story, the story of elitism, of a man convinced that pedigree alone grants authority, of a system where mocking those who come from less privileged paths is still considered sport. But Crockett's response told a different story, the story of perseverance, of a woman who carried not just her degree, but the weight of every struggle it took to earn it. Her words reminded America that true authority doesn't come from the letters stamped on a diploma, but from the integrity with which you wield knowledge. Service, not status. Truth, not theatrics. What she displayed wasn't just quick wit, it was moral gravity. She refused to match sneer with sneer, laughter with rage. Instead, she rose above, demonstrating that dignity is not silence, but strength wrapped in restraint, sharpened by experience. For the millions watching, the moment was more than a political exchange. It was a parable. How many times had people been in her place, dismissed, underestimated, laughed at for who they were or where they came from? Crockett's poise was their vindication. She proved that when arrogance tries to write you out of the story, the most powerful rebuttal is simply living your truth out loud. And in doing so, she offered a universal lesson. Courage is not measured by how loudly you shout, but by how deeply your words echo after the shouting stops. Cruz had performed for his side of the aisle, but Crockett had spoken to history. The resolution of that clash wasn't just a mic drop moment. It was a civic reminder that the ideals Americans claim to cherish, fairness and equality, are still alive when someone dares to stand firmly in them. Crockett showed that elitism can sneer, arrogance can mock, but service anchored in truth will always resonate longer. One clapback? Yes, but also one reminder of what courage still means in America. And yet, the power of that lesson didn't end in that chamber. Its true reach would be revealed only as the world carried it forward.
It began with a laugh, a sneer echoing across the chamber as Ted Cruz dismissed Jasmine Crockett's law degree like it was nothing. But what followed was not just a rebuttal, it was a turning point. Her words, calm yet cutting, didn't just silence Cruz, they reverberated far beyond those walls, carried by millions who saw in her the dignity they themselves had been denied. This wasn't only about one exchange, one smirk, one clapback. It was about what that moment revealed, that arrogance has a short shelf life, but courage endures. Cruz's laugh was a performance. Crockett's words were a principle, and principles, spoken clearly and fearlessly, don't fade when the camera shut off. They embed themselves in the conscience of a country still wrestling with what kind of nation it wants to be. Her voice carried further than one chamber. It carried into America's conscience, into classrooms, workplaces, kitchen tables, into the hearts of those who have been mocked, belittled, underestimated. It reminded them, and all of us, that dignity is not fragile. It cannot be erased with laughter. And that's why we tell this story, not just to relive the clash, but to remember what it means, to stand firm, to speak truth, to refuse to be diminished by arrogance. If you believe those values still matter, if you believe courage deserves to be amplified, then join us. Like this video, share it with someone who needs the reminder, subscribe, and be part of a movement that says truth will not be mocked and dignity will not be silenced. Because every time arrogance laughs, we need voices like Jasmine Crockett's to answer, and we need people like you to make sure the answer echoes.